So yeah, it's fantastic to get this opportunity and come back and kind of share some of the learnings that I've had in the last 5 years. I think it's really important to point out that this is really my experience. And if there's one thing, if you spend a lot of time in startups, you'll see that there's a lot of advice out there, and there's a lot of I guess there's a lot of different ways to go about it, and it's a very personal journey, the way that you go about it. If you think about how a startup begins, it's usually something driven from inside of you, maybe some idea you have or idea you've got with some friends or colleagues. It's a journey that you have to go through as a person in terms of evolution particularly from ourselves as scientists into essentially entrepreneurs and then into leading organizations. It's a difficult journey, and it's something that you will have to go through. And as you go through that, you obviously change a lot. And it is a very personal story in that regard. So I'm going to share with you today, my story of that so far, and kind of how that got to be, and through just a series of lessons that I think may be relevant to you and may be kind of important for that. But I can kind of start with, I guess, like what I would describe as like the pitch that I give to investors. And it's not even investors, there's an element of one of the slides I'll share later on, is it's kind of always about selling. And I mean that in the sense of like whether you're selling to employees, whether you want to join your company, whether you're selling to investors, whether you're selling to customers, whether you're selling to all these folks, in some way coming up with a credible story that you tell. And I guess as CEO, a lot of my job is just repeating the same thing to all the people over and over again, and like having a kind of a set of messages. So I want to start, I guess, with that piece, with kind of what I share with folks in that first 5 sort of 10 minutes that I meet them, and that will give you some kind of context for the rest of the conversation. Okay, so I start with a little bit on myself. So I'm originally from New Zealand. I was always interested in biology growing up. I spent some time growing up in Sweden and Malaysia. So my family were traveling around for work. I came back into college in New Zealand and I studied biotech there. I was really kind of interested in I guess, the combination of biology, technology. Did undergrad there, learned basics of molecular biology. I spent some time in a yeast genetics lab, which was really insightful because it was kind of sort of at this intersection where we're doing a lot of robotics with yeast. And I kind of got this sort of interest in bioinformatics from there. So we were starting to do analysis on genes and the like. That kind of got me, I guess, interested in what you could do in that space. Straight after that, I got an opportunity to join a startup. So this was basically straight out of undergrad. And the company was developing medical devices. There was about 5 people in the company. And it was based out in this like industrial research area. So it was basically like this kind of lab that the company had bought. It had like a little bit of money, let's say, to do some early experiments. What we were trying to do is develop tissue scaffolds, so essentially extracellular matrix. And the idea was that you're going to take this tissue and then be able to place it onto skin for some burns or into soft tissue repair. And then the cells go through that extracellular matrix, sort of go through that, essentially remodel it, and then you end up with like better healing. So I joined this company. It was like a summer intern, very interesting. Like my job was like to go to the abattoir, to like the place where they kill the animals, and like go get like the guts and put them in the back of my car, take them to the lab. And we were trying to figure out ways where we could chemically treat this to basically extract this material. It was such an, I guess, exciting experience. I had never seen anything like this before. It's essentially, these mavericks working in this lab trying to come up with this idea to like essentially, develop a whole medical device. We ended up getting FDA approval for that. I stayed there for 3 or 4 years. I was doing product development, and I kind of saw the impact that you could have in the startup and essentially in that environment. We managed to take that platform. It's now been used tens of millions of patients. The company went public on the Australian Stock Exchange a couple of years ago. And it really just showed me the determination that was required to make something happen. In a startup, you have to like will the thing into existence. It doesn't just happen there. So there was almost like a piece around hard work, which I got from that. But also just that kind of impact that you could have on the world. And it was kind of a little bit addictive. I also saw that biology was becoming very digital. So we were moving away from having to work on the bench to be able to do this kind of stuff in silico. We could all of a sudden we could think about doing this thing on in computers, and that kind of, I guess that got me quite excited in thinking about that. You couldn't study bioinformatics in New Zealand, so I moved to Italy to do a master's in bioinformatics, and that's, I guess, the kind of the starting story of Nextflow and sort of what happened in the next chapter. I spent a couple of years learning basic programming there, kind of dove deep into that aspect, and then spent some time in Cambridge in the UK, where I joined, was at the Sanger Institute. So it was a fantastic place, great campus there, surrounded with genomics. Really it's an inspiring place to work. And then came to CIG to start my PhD, and that's kind of where I met my co-founder Paolo. So I came to CIG primarily for Cedric Notre Dame, who was obviously doing a lot of multiple sequence alignment. Was interested in the space, and I just thought it was a great opportunity there. My PhD was on, let's say, I came to CIG for multiple sequence alignment. If you're familiar with it, it's can be quite computationally expensive, especially what we were trying to do, which was align tens of thousands of sequences and look at the differences between many multiple sequence alignments. That was I guess it was a very interesting problem to be working on at the time because of just the computational expensive piece of it. Now in the lab, essentially the desk next to me was Paolo, who's now my co-founder. And his job in the lab was essentially help us run that kind of analysis. And it was not trivial because the amount of compute that was required, we were submitting stuff to the CRG cluster, and there was all these kind of challenges associated with being able to do that. This, I guess, kind of leads us to one of the things I will speak about later on, which is really kind of like if you can solve a problem that you have yourself, it can obviously get you a long way down the road with regards to that. So Paolo essentially released the first version of Nextflow sort of into 2013. I started using it and was, I guess, user number one, and I started applying it to the work. And I've just found that it was just really like transformational for the work that I was trying to do. A bit of recap: Nextflow allows scientists to write these kind of workflows and then run them and share them on any infrastructure. But from that first experiences, I just saw that there was a lot of potential there. And I kind of slowly, my PhD transitioned into that. We combined a couple of technologies in Nextflow. So one is containerization, so using Docker, which was something kind of relatively new at the time. The adoption of cloud, which is kind of something that was a trend that was happening, as well as what we call like open science or social coding. Scientists starting to put their code onto GitHub, think about kind of preprint servers, and the idea that folks were like sharing their work like that. I guess the timing was really right for something like Nextflow. Probably wasn't quite right for a business at that time, but the timing was definitely right in terms of creating a technology which people needed there. Fast forward a few years, so get towards the end of my PhD, still really loving Nextflow, realized that there would be some kind of opportunity to do that. Paolo and myself just wanted to work on the technology. So we created Seqera Labs, where we were both still at CIG. This was around 2018. Started with some very basic, kind of support services or kind of training. So we were traveling around Europe doing training. Was very kind of low key. Raised about 100,000 to build an MVP, a very basic MVP, and we realized that it's very hard to monetize open source. So we created a second product, which is essentially a management plane on top of those pipelines, and that's how we got our first recurring revenue, which was we released that end of 2019. Started 2020, we got our first recurring revenue, signed a couple of pharma companies, and I guess the rest is history. That's so, whilst the project's 10 years old, the company in terms of hiring folks and in terms of just raising VC money is around 3 years, old now. In that time, we've gone from essentially 0 customers to about over 150. The recurring revenue of companies now coming up to 4 million, sort of increased it from about 1 million last year. We're about 50 people in total now, expect to be maybe 100 before the end of the year. So growing relatively fast. And just the kind of problems that we're working on, the kind of things that our customers are doing with the technology, it's just a kind of really almost exciting work that there is. And I'll show some examples of that later on. So that's a kind of, I kind of glossed over a little bit of the stuff in between there to get there, but that's kind of the brief introduction that I would typically give to folks as well. Okay, just going to share with you some slides now and kind of go through some of those pieces there. Okay, So what are we looking at? Sometimes it's, and particularly in this space, we're very lucky in that we can really tie ourselves to a bit more of a mission. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of startups out there, there's a lot of technology out there, which is, a single click checkout, or, something which is just tied to this, purely virtual world. I have a belief that there's actually like hard problems out there, and those hard problems are typically to do with atoms, things in the physical world versus sort of bits and bytes, which we've obviously made a lot of improvements with the technology recently. This belief they have is around kind of tech-enabled biology. Some people call this the century of biology, the idea that we will be able to use all of the ability to read, to write, to edit DNA, to apply that to the physical world with regards to, obviously traditional biotech, with regards to health and agriculture, manufacturing, so development of new materials, as well as energy and the like. And our kind of belief is that by building that infrastructure today, that's the kind of, that there's going to be, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of businesses which will explode into this area and be dependent on that moving forward. So just to give you some examples of some of our customers and kind of what they're doing and why this is important. So this is an example from Genentech. I was actually just out in San Francisco about 10 days ago at the Genentech campus. If you ever get a chance to go there, it's absolutely phenomenal. There's about 20,000 people in a single campus working on this stuff, and it's like a city in South San Francisco. Absolutely incredible out there. The possibilities here are really incredible. They've taken the BioNTech platform, so the same one that was used for the COVID vaccine, and here they're sampling, basically take a sample of tumor sample from a patient and from normal tissue from a patient, and they sequence them both. Obviously, a lot of sequencing involved, hence the kind of need for a lot of analysis on that. And then they look at the essentially predict the neoantigens on the surface of the tumor. So they do some machine learning, identify what's likely to be on the surface of those tumor cells, and specifically on the surface of those tumor cells. And then they engineer an mRNA against that, and then inject that mRNA into the patient, so that the patient can essentially receive the mRNA. The mRNA obviously causes an immune response against the tumor, and then of course, hopefully the patient is kind of cured. This is the kind of example of personalized medicine where this kind of larger volumes of sequencing is required, where it obviously has to be done in a very reproducible and a kind of clinical way. So it shows off some of the examples of what's possible with this. As I mentioned before, another big one that's kind of coming up, some people call this like synbio is kind of becoming a name, but it's like synthetic biology, the idea that we'll be developing new materials. Here, this is another example with Zymogen, very interesting company out there. I think they were recently bought by Ginkgo, which you may have heard of, obviously developing a lot of really interesting ways that you can always have synthetic biology as a platform and building on this. Again, for us, the key focus is lots of sequencing, lots of analysis. Here's a really interesting one, which is kind of more on the computational side. One of our customers, 23andMe, they use AWS for running their imputation pipeline. And imputation is obviously a pretty computationally expensive piece when you need to run it across all of their data set, which you can imagine there's tens of millions or millions of people. This blue line is the number of CPUs in an environment. So they're running like tens of thousands of CPUs into that. So it's, again, we are primarily helping them enable that kind of analysis that they couldn't do previously. And essentially their software makes it easy for these folks to run that kind of analysis. Okay, a couple of other ones here. Obviously, SARS-CoV-2, Nextflow was involved pretty early on. They helped to develop some pipelines. Those pipelines could then be submitted out, shared out to the point of sequencing. You can imagine that they had sort of sequencing sites all around the UK and around the world. And the fact that the analysis could be run anywhere means that you're sharing the workload, you're sharing the pipeline to where the data is. And that obviously helps to speed things up a bit and have things happen pretty efficiently with regards to that. So that's just some examples of the stuff that that we've been involved with, that Seqera has been involved with. As I say, we're really excited to share more and more of these stories as we learn it. And I think that as a founder or someone involved in startups in this area, you should really use this to your advantage when it comes to hiring, because there'll become a point in time where you're hiring people who don't know anything about bio. Maybe they don't have a background in that. You need to hire a finance person. But if you can excite them with the mission, if you can excite them with this piece, they can feel that they can work on something which is a lot more, powerful for them as an individual. And that's something which we see now, particularly as it relates to, maybe you can't pay people so much, but maybe they can work on something which is exciting. So keep that in mind as you think about on the hiring side. Okay, why now? Well, there's a couple of things about my theory on why this, and I think this applies broadly to really anyone thinking about bio-based startups here. The first, as I mentioned before, around the digitalization of biology. So the ability to read, write, and edit at scale is just something that we haven't seen before, and it's going to open up a whole lot of possibilities for what's possible. The lab infrastructure is definitely improving. There's the fact that we can automate a lot of things, and there's, again, so this whole idea of kind of lab automation is a big area as well. The talent and the funding models is also really critical to be able to scale this, as well as the data and compute, which is, I guess, what we focus on more as data and compute. That's, I guess, the piece of the problem that we're focusing on. But obviously, all these things are related to being able to kind of scale that up. I guess this is why I think this is slightly changed from when I gave this when I originally gave this talk last year, in the sense of the amount of capital available. There's definitely there has been a reduction in the amount of biotech capital in the last 6 months. This is just a reality of the zero interest rate environment, which we've come out of pretty abruptly. In saying so, if you look at the funding rates that are going into biotech, it's still like significant, it's still more than it was, let's say, 5 years ago or so. So there is definitely still funding available out there for great startups. There has come in from a period of the last couple of years where that was a sort of increasing amount. There's also like the different models of funding have changed a little bit. We were typically thinking about, you would have academic research, which would be publicly funded, say, for the most part. And then you would do some kind of, where you would basically switch over to be like kind of privately funded in a sense. And there was almost just this like separation between those two things. But even if we consider on the private side, there's now really interesting models for how you can do this. There's a company called Molecule, very interesting, which has almost like a decentralized funding model where you can buy tokens, and it's slightly in the crypto space, but you can buy tokens, and those tokens essentially allow you to vote on what research gets developed. And then from there, essentially, any of the development of that is essentially the IP is owned by the token holders. An interesting model of essentially how we can think about how we can fund research in the future. I've met some folks who are from, there's some very interesting places in the US, which are set up as time-funded research orgs. So they have a mandate, 5 years, we're going to work on this project. And then from there, anything that comes off it will be developed in alternative ways. There is places like Altos Labs. It's one of our customers. That is this is the one which is funded from folks like Jeff Bezos, and that is really primarily around aging. But they have almost like a different remit. They're funded as a startup, but the whole idea is to kind of go after these really large problems. So very wide and different models. I've even seen a company which is a startup, but all of the equity is essentially split between all of the employees in some stakes. So like a whole bunch of different models out there. In terms of the funding side as well, investors have become a lot more sophisticated in this area. There's a lot more choice that's available, and there's a lot more folks that can help you kind of go through that as well. I've already made a couple of introductions to VCs and from other startups and CIG recently as well. And there's this kind of more of an ecosystem which we can all work together to build out, which I think benefits everyone as we think to kind of grow this piece out as well. Just to touch in on the data and compute side, because this is really what we do. Obviously, there's a large amount of computation which is required to do this stuff. Here's an example just of a typical pipeline which folks are running. If you're familiar with bioinformatics, you may be familiar with it. Samples go in, lots of different steps that have got to run on here. When those pipelines run, essentially you need to do this at scale across thousands of machines. Managing all of that is kind of key. There's also other bits around it. So with regards to the data management, it's like the notebooks, for example, interactive pieces, which are really critical, and all of this comes together. So this is a kind of a brief overview of where I think we're at in terms of Seqera and how we think about it. Other things that I guess I would consider, and like, when we're trying to create a company and trying to think about how we talk about the future, it's often useful to look at comparables. So comparable companies that you want to be like, or that have done something in before. Now, they may have not done it exactly like you've done it before. Maybe there's pieces that you like of particular companies that they like. So for us, one of the main ones is a company called Benchling. If you're familiar in the wet lab, they have done this. So they've essentially created a free notebook. That free notebook, they essentially got wet lab scientists into the platform. And now that business was last valued about 6 billion in terms of valuation. There it's so runs at a sort of hundreds of millions of revenue from there, and really kind of growing from this desire to fix this problem with the wet lab. We think we can do something very similar in the dry lab, in the bioinformatics space, and kind of to target that. Okay, so 10 simple rules. Keeping this really simple, I think the first thing, you've got to do something you love. You really got to do something that you care about. It's a marathon. It's definitely not a sprint in this regard. So we have been working on Nextflow now 10 years, and still early in the game with regards to that. So keeping that kind of mindset is really important. How you do that and how you keep motivated and the like, I think there's a whole bunch of stuff that you need to do with regards to whether it means to keeping yourself motivated with regards to the goals that you're on. You have to enjoy it, of course. It's not always going to be easy, but overall, if you feel like you're doing something that has value, that provides value for other folks, then that can help you a lot. But it's certainly not easy. Doing something you love will make it easier, or will make it possible. So something just to keep in mind. I can't tell you what you love, so I think that's something that everyone has to figure out for themselves. But hopefully that they can do that and make things easier as well. I think in my example here, it was very much on the technology and I guess being involved with it and seeing the impact that it was having. That kind of gave me meaning in the piece, and it kind of gave me meaning to be able to do it, and still does today. And I think that if you have that piece, it will help you a lot in terms of those tough periods as well. Other one here is really finding the right co-founders that complement your skills here. And there's a lot of information out there around kind of like how you structure your company. This is probably this is probably like the most important piece in it, because if you get this wrong, it can go obviously very wrong. And if you get this right, it can just be a huge unlock for yourself. So it's a little bit hard to find. I think we were in a fortunate situation that we got some time to work with each other for some years before. So we kind of knew that there was already a solid kind of working relationship with regards to how we were going to function. But spend the time on this. Make sure that you're aligned in the way that you work. If you can find folks that complement your skills. So Paulo himself is a software engineer. He worked in kind of software development and banks and the like. Obviously, it's kind of crucial for the development of Nextflow platform and software. I think I kind of had like slightly more softer skills with regards to being able to communicate with customers, being able to communicate, the kind of doing the early sales, doing the early training and the like. And that's kind of continued today. And I think that we still see this kind of pretty clear separation of our roles in that. And on that separation of roles, I think it's really important as well that you do clearly define who does what, who owns what, because otherwise you can end up with a lot of conflicts with regards to like how things are going to be managed. There is an infinite amount of things to do. And the last thing you want is two people kind of trying to like butting heads over something, which is maybe not insignificant in the bigger picture, bigger picture of stuff as well. And then there's also around like you're not going to be able to have everything within your team, like within your co-founding team. There is going to be stuff you're going to need to hire for, which I'll get to in a moment to find examples, show you some examples of that. With regards to the co-founding team, I mean, there is folks who do it themselves. I mean, there's some brilliant companies which have been built by solo entrepreneurs. There's also, larger teams of 3, 4, people who have done it. I think that there is, in terms of teams larger than 3 or 4, what I've seen anyway is that it eventually ends up to be some fracturing. It seems impossible. It's really difficult to imagine more than 4 or more people really putting the same amount of effort in over many years. In the same way, there almost has to be some sort of separation of pieces there. So be very careful with that. And I think this kind of also applies with regards to equity as well. When you think about that equity structure early on and how you structure that, you're essentially putting equity in for in your journey. So getting that right at the beginning is kind of critical to do that. And I'm happy to speak on some examples of that. The next thing is fundraise from people you trust. I think coming from a scientist mindset, you think that business and fundraising is going to be very transactional. That you think it's going to be, I do this for this much money, you do that for that much money, and that's kind of how it happened. And in fact, I just found it completely the opposite of what I expected here. Fundraising and essentially choosing those investors or essentially they become partners it's actually much more personal than you get in science. In some ways, science becomes a little bit cold in relation to this, given the fact, we're often just doing experiments and publishing papers. And there's a little bit of that, like the relationship piece, which I've actually learned more and more as I've been in business. So as an example of our first investor that we got, we were spending some time over at a place called Creative Destruction Labs, flying to Montreal for essentially a kind of accelerator thing. And the first investor we got there was a guy called Millard. He had was sort of investing in the biospace, and the way that relationship works. I mean, I still kind of WhatsApp him, every couple of days. That even 5 years later or so, 4 years later or so, we still have a very close relationship. These are the people that are going to introduce you to the next people. These are the people who are going to help you hire. These are the people you're going to rely on when things get tough. So fundraising from those people that trust, it's like a job interview. It's really like, maybe you have fewer choices. Maybe you have got less choice to who you fundraise from, but they are going to have to be there in the tough times. They're going to have to be there to help you out. They're going to be the network that you need to unlock. So fundraise from people you trust. I guess our funding story, we raised 100,000 very early on from essentially a family and friends. We then raised 200,000 from Millard, which is essentially our first kind of VC investment. Then we raised 600,000 from Speed Invest, which was one of the first European seed funds. And then they introduced us to Talus, who kind of led the seed round, which was about 3.5 million. And then they introduced us to Addition, which led the Series A, which was 22 million. So this constant kind of relationship piece has been really kind of key to build. And the other thing is that the expertise that these folks provide you, I think particularly as you get into the later rounds, they will help you hire. They will help put you in contact with people who will help you hire and to build that team out, which becomes so essential. Which I guess leads us on to the next point, which is really around building that team and how you can do that. I probably spend 20 to 30% of my time now hiring people. And it's not an insignificant amount. Currently, we're hiring for our essentially engineering leader. And we will probably interview something like 20 people each. And then there will be essentially across maybe 2 or 3 people will do those interviews. So each, so you end up with, it's going to be 100 hours or 150 hours of interviewing just before we even get to the first phase on that. And it's become super essential, particularly as you think about building a leadership team or folks around you for doing that, to hire those people. Now, it's a little bit different early on. We were coming in a market where it was very hard to hire. I feel like there was like a big inflation in salaries and it was essentially coming from a very tight job market, where it was very difficult for us to hire people. No one, two guys in Barcelona working the startup that no one heard of, being able to hire, great folks to build that is very kind of difficult. I guess if I could do it again, I would really kind of think about those first hires that you do, and do everything you can in your network to find the right people. It's not an easy thing. In fact, I think this is probably, once you have raised money, and this is just the thing that you should spend an outsized amount of time on, and because getting the right people just unlocks you a little bit, like having the right co-founder. It just unlocks you for things. One of the first hires that we did very early on was just on the sales side. We sell software. We sell essentially enterprise software that folks have to buy. We didn't have experience in doing that. Like, I had never bought enterprise software, let alone sold it. So we got the first sales, and then kind of quickly we were in a fortunate situation where we actually had someone who we worked with previously, who actually was a partner from CRG, essentially someone who was selling software to CRG for the HPC system. And he joined as like essentially chief commercial officer, took a big risk, stepped down from a relatively large company to run the commercial side. And I think it was one of those things that was just very fortunate in our situation. It allowed us to do those kind of sales that we wouldn't have been able to do, and build out that commercial piece. And he's still with the company today. So that's the kind of piece where you want to realize your own weaknesses, or your own kind of places where you need support on, and lean into that a lot. That will obviously help you a lot in terms of doing that. Other things on hiring. So to give context, now with the executive hiring, so we're kind of building this first sort of leadership team that I'm doing. We use executive recruiters for that, and we pay them pretty well for finding those positions. But it's just so essential to get it. Like, I can't stress enough how important it is having the right people for you and on that team. And now my role is shifted. Now we're about 50 people, and a lot of people look to me and to show kind of leadership in these pieces. I need to have the right folks around me who are helping me with that message, who are helping with those materials, who are able to motivate the team around the mission, and the like. So getting that right is also critically important as well. Okay. This next one here around so creating a vision and mission that people can get behind, I think is pretty key. I think that our one, we were a little bit lucky here that we already had this Nextflow community. We had this piece that had been around for quite a few years when we created the company. So there was already a lot of values tied into it. Those values around transparency, around open source, around open science. They were already kind of baked into everything that we were doing. But in saying so, you still need to be kind of conscious of this. Even our vision and mission, I think, is tied in. Now, I'm not saying that, like, I don't believe you have to create a vision and mission like from day one, but if you do, it can just help provide a little bit of direction. And I think particularly if you are aligned with your, you have to be aligned with your co-founders and the early team on that, because that will just help you set a direction for what you're doing. Now, I think just before I joined, I heard you talking about kind of pivot and the like. I think that if you think about that, you can think about the vision. The vision could remain the same, but then maybe on the mission you could pivot on. So you could be, okay, we want to go in this direction, let's say, but the way we get there could be kind of different. It's something it may evolve over time, and in fact we've kind of evolved ours mostly around wording. I can give you an example of kind of what that looks like. We've kind of thinking about like how we think about our vision is a better world through accelerated scientific discovery. It's kind of describes a little bit around the world that we want to live in. We want to create this better world, which is essentially tied to things like what's possible with biology, with human health, all of the things I spoke about before with tech-enabled biology. And we do that by enabling other scientists. So this idea of accelerating scientific discovery, the idea of helping other folks achieve that as well. The other one here is on the kind of mission. We started off very focused on the pipeline space. Like that's what we started with. Like we came from Nextflow, high throughput, batch computation. It's a specific problem. It's a very hard problem. but that's where our focus was. And now over time, we realized that there's actually a whole lot of adjacent problems. And I think that maybe this is something that you can think about, is that when you start your startup, you are probably focusing on one tiny piece. And I think I would describe it as you should nail that piece. But once you've nailed that piece well, then maybe you're the leader in it, maybe you are, you've got some particular insights, it gives you the right to start working on the adjacent problems. And that's how you can really start to grow your business. So for us, the piece was like high throughput computation, was like batch computation, which is performed with Nextflow. I guess the piece that we solved commercially was then how do you set up the infrastructure to run that, as well as kind of monitor those workloads. And now the piece that we're working on, and this is something we're sort of be developing over the next year, is how you can manage the data with regards to that. So kind of a key piece of the problem. So upstream of that, and then sort of downstream of that, how you can do things like interactivity. So this could be RStudio or Jupyter Notebooks, Shiny apps, IGV things, all of those kind of pieces. And I guess like we have, we've developed the point where we have the right now to be able to work on those pieces and can do this effectively. You need to be careful here, because as a startup, you've got very limited resources, and how you focus those resources is not an easy thing. And particularly if you start working with engineers and the like, very keen to like go build their own things, excited about, working on the stuff. And often it's just not quite tied to the customer problem. So being really aware of what the customer problem is there is really important as well. So I kind of just, I'll touch on that later on. When we think about our values are very much tied to where we come from and the problems that we have. So obviously this focus on innovation and curiosity, we really kind of are scientists at heart as part of that. And obviously, as we're trying to work with scientists, this idea that we will have kind of maintain this curiosity to always be learning with regards to that. The openness comes primarily from both open source in terms of the software that we provide. A lot of it is open source, but also like openness in terms of open science and sharing of those ideas, sharing of how you create infrastructure and the like. This kind of goes all the way through the company. If you think about in our say weekly meetings, we share all of the metrics around the business. So this would be regards to full revenue, expenses, costs, how the business is structured, how we make decisions and the like. And there's no like one solution for this, but at least by having these values, you can kind of help guide people onto how to act in certain situations, because it's going to be very quickly you'll go into a situation where you are not able to see every decision, every piece. You just have to kind of really go with it with that. Okay. Other ones is around kind of commitment to craft here. So as you grow out your team, everyone's going to have pretty different skills, and you kind of want them to have different skills. But what is that kind of core piece that you're going to have? Well, one thing that can become pretty hard is around delegation, like in terms of roles and stuff. So if you're able to quickly and able to easily define what you care about, we care about things coming out high quality. It's important for us that when we release software, it really works because of the importance of that. That means getting the right people in place and giving them the right tools to be able to perform it the way that they need to. Driven by impact is a big one as well for us. So obviously, when we think about the impact that we have on Nextflow across those 16,000 people who read documentation or the organizations that we support, we really want to see them succeed. And in doing so, we'll have the impact that we want. And then this kind of final one is just around doing the right thing. So making sure that we are, the decisions that we make internally are for the mission, are actually taking us in that same direction, so that we don't do that. And just kind of setting these guidelines up. I would still say like we're pretty early in this. I need to, as my job is to reinforce this more and bring this up. And we're doing a bunch of stuff around how you do that. Okay. I mentioned before around building things that like around the kind of engineering and how there's so many things to build. I think particularly in software, there's an unlimited possibility of things that you can do. you need to tie that back to something though. And the way that I like to think about it is just really building something that you want. And there's a kind of expression that I started, sort of I've heard before. It's a little bit vulgar, but if you'll excuse me, it's kind of build shit, sell shit. And in some way, that's the kind of the thing that we're trying to do in the startup here. I've actually expanded that now to like build stuff, sell stuff, support stuff, because you also have to support the piece afterwards is kind of key. But how you do that is actually building stuff that people want. And I think that with Nextflow early on, we found that, but you need to really understand exactly what the market wants. Is there a market for your thing? Now, sometimes you can be too early. Sometimes you need to create a market. Sometimes you need to create ways for people to see the product, which they wouldn't be able to before. But still, there has to be a lighthouse. There still has to be a fundamental piece of the market who wants to buy your stuff. And if you tie it back to what I mentioned around how many options there is, how many ways you can take your company, so easy to get distracted. It's so easy to go into a million different things that is not tied back to that one. We've recently brought in kind of what we call products. So if you're familiar with software development, like product managers, and we recently have a head of product from MongoDB. The idea is it's just channeling the customer's need and channeling the customer's need into what you build here. If you do that, a lot of the rest of the business can become a lot easier. If sales essentially will, cover up a lot of the mistakes that you will make along the way. And everyone will make, as a first-time entrepreneur, you'll make so many mistakes along the way. In fact, it would be surprising if half the decisions were not mistakes along the way. But if you build something that people want, it will cover up a lot of them. It will get you a long way down the road and sort of much further down the road than you would think as well. There's some stuff you can do to test this. Obviously, like this is the whole idea of MVP, that you release something early. You see if people like it, you see if like how they respond to it without kind of making big investments in big pieces. That's obviously like something kind of we did with Tower, and something I guess the whole Nextflow experience was kind of started from something very small and building it up. As you do that, it may be a little bit more difficult with regards to other products, but you can get out there and you can try and essentially trying to sell your product even before it's ready is a great experience and something that I would really recommend. So if you've got something, even if you've got the idea, take it out there, test it. The feedback that you get will be so much more valuable than anything you've got. The ideas that you're talking about with your co-founders or thing, they mean nothing until they're in front of a customer. And so really keep that in mind as you think about building out MVPs. And then once you've got a product, or even as you're thinking about having a product, how are you actually going to make money off it? What's the business model here? This is where you can really lean on comparables, but it's really important to understand the fundamentals of your business. We were stuck in, we come from a model where we were starting with something like Nextflow, huge amounts of compute. So Nextflow can process, we have some customers who spend $20,000 per execution of the pipeline on cloud. So you think, wow, if we could just take a percentage of that. And this is like, kind of early business model. Okay, we just need to take a percentage of that compute because we're helping them so much. But it doesn't work like that. So it's essentially, you're not aligned with the customer in that way. So we spent quite a bit of time thinking about how this was going to work. And we've essentially settled on, at least for the most part now, just like a very basic seat model. So per seat that you have in the application is what we charge on. But it was only, I guess, through trial and error that we got to that point and trying to understand exactly what that business model will look like. You can model it out. Like, for example, we have very typical enterprise sales. So the average enterprise deal is about $50,000 per customer that we have. If we look at comparables, something like Benchling, the average deal now is about $200,000. So we should both grow what we call ACV, the average contract value, as well as the number of customers that we have. And when we think about our growth, we model out both the number of new customers we have. But then in a subscription business, the really important thing is what we call the NRR. So the how much you can take $1 with a current customer today to how much that becomes the next year. those customers are very sticky. So our NRR, for example, is about 140. It means that we can guarantee that for every $1 of current customer revenue we have, that will be worth $1.40 next year. And that can be from growth of accounts, that can be growth of features, but it just means that you can start to model this business out. And this is like the real value of SaaS. Like, this is why everything you'll see nowadays is a subscription, because the idea is it's very kind of common and recurring. That doesn't necessarily work if you're developing a new biologic or a new piece. You have to understand that in that model, you're typically trying to de-risk the business. Potentially, you're trying to find complete some experiments which will de-risk it for the next person to buy it. And in that case, you're very often trying to take the technology and say sell it on to someone else who will develop it further. So understanding the business there is going to be really key. And again, studying some comparables here is the first thing I would do. Talk to people, explain your business. They will tell you, oh, so it's a bit like XYZ. Oh, it's a bit like that. And then go and read up about that. See how they grew. Understand what the drivers were. What levers can you pull in that business to be able to grow that out as well? And that's kind of the key. Something that's like, I would, you should try and get that understanding of that early on. And the more convincing you are of that, I think will show that you have really thought about how your business grows in the long term, and can obviously help you a lot with sort of investor conversations and the like as well. Okay, develop an IP strategy. Now, this can be more or less significant depending on your business as well. So very early on, obviously, we released Nextflow as open source. So anyone can take it, use it. People can sell it if they want. It's completely kind of open in that. So in a way, that is an IP strategy. It's a very loose one, but it's an IP strategy in itself. The reason that we did it like this is that we wanted distribution. We essentially think of open source as a massive distribution model, which allows us then to sell into the enterprise. It also allows us to have the software essentially like a Trojan horse through these pharma companies. Everyone's using it in production. And then you go onto a call with pharma company XYZ and you start introducing the technology and they say, oh, don't worry, we've already got 60 pipelines in Nextflow and they're in production and we can't change the version. So you can basically get into it in that way. That's like one extreme example of an IP strategy. The other obvious examples are, you could lock things down, you could make things tight, you could patent things. I think you're going to do a whole sections and stuff looking at the different options here. But one thing would just be kind of aware of what your IP strategy is. I think it matters less than people think it does in some sense. So obviously being protected is important, but I think that there's a little bit of an overemphasis on IP strategy, whereas just kind of getting it right early on and then kind of going with it. There's a whole lot of other stuff that will, there's probably, let's say, there's a lot of dead companies out there with a lot of patents, I would say. So just keep that in mind as you go through that as well. Part of my here is always be learning. I think that in my own journey going through this, it's been an incredibly invigorating experience in terms of this. And even today, it's like my role changes every 6 months. That evolution, I think, kind of requires a little bit of an open mind for sure to be able to do that. But it also kind of like allows you to experience incredible things. In terms of just of the folks that you get to spend time with, I talked about having those 20 interviews that I've been doing, say, for the last couple of weeks on the engineering role. That's an example where I get to talk to 20 incredibly intelligent, hardworking, focused people from an area, and I can just, it's my job. I get to just speak to them and learn from them. And in some way, that's a real privilege. It's a privilege to who you get to spend your time with, and the things that you can do there. There's obviously a personal evolution piece around things like people management, management of your own time. I think becomes pretty important as well, and something which is not always easy. But being able to do that effectively as well is also very important. I've been learning more about the industry as well. So for us, mostly looking into things like how software businesses work, but also more kind of in the biotech side, and just really kind of learning from people around you. So that's something that can help a lot. I would say if you're thinking about this, there's also I still today, I spent a lot of time listening to podcasts because it's a different vocabulary. If you start going speaking to investors and you come from being a scientist, you don't know the right words to use, you don't know the right things that they're thinking. But I've got a couple of great podcasts I'm happy to recommend that just allowed me to jump into that world. And I ride my bike in every day. I can spend 40 minutes, to and from work, immersing myself in that world, understanding the vocabulary, understanding how they think. And that, I think, has given me a lot of insight into thinking, particularly on the investment side. I would say I'm sure that there is equivalent ones in your own industry, in your own domain. But that's definitely a new world that you have to learn. So being able to do that successfully is really important as well. And then finally, I would just say go for it. I think that there is so much, you can spend a lot of time, debating what to do, whether to think about it, but you don't really know until you try. If you've got the means, and I don't, of course, there is like financial considerations and being able to do that, and being able to have the time, the space in your life, whether that's regards to family or means to be able to do so. But if you can, I would definitely say go for it. It's something which you'll likely not regret. You will evolve hugely from in terms of your own personal journey that you'll be on, and it will also just like it'll also say like you don't want to be sitting there with regret, thinking, "What if I did do that?" or "I had that idea, and tried it." So my takeaway piece would be kind of go for it. So I think with that, I can wrap it up there. But I would love to go. I think we take some time to go through some discussions, or I'm happy to go through some other pieces if people have got more questions, and we're happy to share with you some other stuff.
Evan, thank you so much. That was incredibly rich in advice and life experience in entrepreneurship you shared. Let's open it up to everybody. Time for questions, and you can have direct question on Evan, what he spoke about, or general questions, anything like. It's an excellent time to really probe the head of someone who's been there and done that, and not that many years ago looked very much like you did. So yeah, if you have a question, I think just take your mic off and ask. If there's too many people, I'll try and control it.
Hi, Evan. Sorry, can I just say a word before, because I have just a couple of comments. And first of all, I'd like to say to Evan, this was absolutely amazing, and thank you for the talk. And you mentioned quite a few things, but there is one that I have seen developing through the years, and that was quite impressive. It is the fact that most successful people eventually fail because they do not properly recognize the reason behind their success. It's a very common pattern you see happening all the time. And the specificity of your trajectory of your journey is that you and Paolo have consistently identified the very reason behind your success. You knew this was to be open source, and everybody around you was saying, no, close it, close it. You knew it was open source, you kept pushing for it to be open source. You knew this was all about fostering the community. They were saying, do some training, training is good, just survive with training. No, you took care of the community. And on, you kept taking low-level decisions that showed a very deep understanding of the reason why you had been successful the step before. And, really as an observer, because it's a long time this is out of my hands, I have been absolutely impressed to see this capacity. And in fact, the key secret is really ask yourself, why have I been successful in the last step? And if you get it right, you'll be successful the next one. The second one, I have to say, and that's about the CRG and the culture of the CRG and the influence of Roderick Bigot. If you had come to the lab 5 years earlier, I don't think you could have done Nextflow, because I don't think I would have, as a PI, had the capacity to give you the freedom. I would have been too much in control. And this was not a project and blah, 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 blah. And if I have an advice to give to anyone who wants this kind of success to happen in their lab, trust people and give them freedom. It works. And it's difficult to trust people because, you know, at the end of the day, your lab is yourself, and if it fails, everybody, but you have to trust people. And that worked amazingly well. So yeah, thanks a lot. And I apologize for taking the time. I have just one tiny question. You don't have to answer, but when was because, you know, the lab was never an entrepreneurship lab. So I never had in my mind that so many people would start companies. So when was the tilting point, Evan? When was the very moment you said, okay, yeah, I'll do it? What happened?
I'm not sure if there really is a specific point. I think it was driven from a desire to work on the problem. I think it just came internally that like really wanted to keep going with the technology. I saw Seqera as a vehicle for that. And like it's just a vehicle of my career to like, you know, to be able to keep doing that. Obviously, like what we wanted to do, staying in a research organization wasn't necessarily at the right place for that. Obviously, as you start to grow out. So I don't think it was like, I just like, you know, to back up on your point, I fully agree as well. Like creating that space, creating the ability to do something, let's say out of the box. If you knew exactly that this research was going to end up in a company, let's say, or this research translates into this idea, then of course everyone would do this. Like the point being that in research you can do things that you don't know what's going to happen, and I think that's the beauty of this, is that there was no goal to create anything. Like in the same that I wasn't trying to create this, it was just that really solve the problem that I was, you know, that we were passionate about, and then obviously, you know, get some kind of product market fit to grow.
I support this. I mean, as a lab manager, you were not obsessed about creating a company, and neither were Paulo. You guys were just obsessed about cracking problems, and you got so excited. I remember about Nextflow and about the reproducibility. You know, it was a big thing. You didn't talk, but Evan figured out that Nextflow was making things reproducible, and this, you know, this opened all the possibility. And that was not because you wanted to build a business out of it. It's just because you were curious. And I am not surprised that this curiosity keeps driving your business, because it is the engine. It is the true engine, and you made a very strong point. And yeah, it's very exciting. So thanks a lot. I won't talk more, but really, thanks a lot. This was a great talk and very inspirational for everyone. Thanks, Evan.
Awesome. Thanks, Cedric.
Great. Thanks, Cedric. Who's next? There are a couple of other hands up. Someone was there. Other questions? Go see, yeah.
Hi, I will ask you a little bit to comment about the specificity of doing a startup in a research institution, and how did you find it? And I know it's awkward since Cedric is here, but I wonder about the intellectual property, the support that you were getting, and actually the things that you had to fight and discuss with to be able to, you know, successfully spin off a company.
Yeah, no, I'm very open. I have been very open and vocal in the past about this, and I continue to be, because I believe in, you know, fighting for. I don't want to use the word fighting. I believe in the word like for fighting for entrepreneurs who do want to get, you know, who do want to make their businesses a reality. I would say that like at the time that we spun out or you know, created a thing, it was very challenging. We did a 1 year of extreme painful negotiation with CIG-TPDO prior to Annabelle's time, that was extremely detrimental to what we were doing in the business. It was protracted. It was non-efficient. It was really crazy. You know, the software was open source, so essentially anyone could do the business except for us. It was very, very kind of backwards in this way. In the end, we got to an agreement, which is probably still very one-sided, but it allowed us to do what we needed to do. I'm a big believer now in standardized documents. I think that across academia, there should be a standardized set of agreements, which everyone knows what they're doing coming into it. So there should be no negotiation on these things, or very little negotiation on these things. Everyone can come in. We know what the IP's legal is going to look like. We know what the structure is going to look like. And that way that it just saves a lot of wasted time. And it just helps the entrepreneurs. And the key thing as well is that you're going to get investors who are going to come in and they're going to look at those documents, that first thing. And if you're in a situation where there's any kind of weird things going on or strange, structures, it's just going to hurt. It's just going to hurt the business long term. So, I mean, I don't know the state of the play from my understanding, from what I've heard. It's it's improved significantly, but. Obviously, I think we can always do things better, and we should really be trying to make it easier for folks to create businesses in CIG, and to make that process as painless as possible.
Right. Thank you, Jasmine.
Hello, thank you, Evan, for your presentation. Well, I have a question about the co-founders and the criteria. What do you think are the most criteria to take account when you choose a co-founder?
I think the first thing you have to have the same working values, in the sense that if my co-founder works like 3 times more than me or 4 times more than me, or there's some kind of feeling that the person's not pulling their weight in some sense, so not working it's going to be a recipe for disaster. So you both have to be really fully into the thing, because otherwise you can just imagine the conflicts which arise. You are splitting the equity in the company for the future effort. It's for the effort over those next years. And if you end up in situations where you think that the effort is not aligned in that way, it's just going to create a lot of conflict when it comes down to it. I also think that the thing, as I mentioned before, is around just deciding who's doing what, and then knowing the strengths of the person. In my example, obviously I leave all of the Nextflow engineering, the structure of this to Paolo, and I almost just forget about that completely, which is great. And then I can focus on the things that okay. So getting that kind of agreement on those areas as well is key. Obviously, you have to be able to spend time with the person as well. You're going to be spending a lot of time, whether it's particularly early on, same room, the same space. So being able to have a kind of basic, working relationship is just really essential.
Okay. So, Cedric, you want to make another comment?
No, not a comment. It's a question. And so everybody wakes up in the middle of the night thinking, how is deep learning going to impact my life? What is going to be the influence, you think, of all these very recent development? I mean, 2 years ago, everybody was very sad about low qualified jobs and all the plumbers and all that stuff. Well, my plumber is very fine. I hope he will be coming this week. But scientists and teachers are having a harder time. So what do you think? Have you thoughts thinking about it?
Yeah, I think in the business space, there's going to probably be some examples I've heard recently in terms of who's going to win. I think one thing that's interesting about this is that the incumbents, things like Microsoft and Google and the like, they're actually got a bit of a head start. If you think about most technological revolutions, it's usually startups that can move really quickly and kind of disrupt the piece. But in this case, it's maybe slightly different, where there already is incumbents with a huge advantage, whether that's, and no one's going to be able to train the models like them. So that's, I guess, one degree that's interesting about it. I also think there'll probably be a situation a little bit like, Apple versus Linux, in the sense that there is a one, solution which kind of provides everything in a single ecosystem locked down. And then another piece, which is around the openness of that. And we already see that with things like OpenAI, which is actually not the open one, and Hugging Face, which is kind of providing these kind of models and the infrastructure for that. There's an interesting piece where that compute runs. And if we think about even in relation to the data, it's super sensitive. So examples would be in Amazon, if you buy something on shopping, right? Amazon doesn't put the actual contents of the shopping cart into your email, because then Google will just scrape that and then use that information to train their model. So the companies themselves are going to treat their models as proprietary information. How that can be served will likely be that it sort of has some infrastructure. You'll probably move the model to where the data is to run that infrastructure locally for enterprise customers, and then kind of serve that out. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in the infrastructure layer to go on. The application layer, I don't know enough. I don't think anyone can really predict where we're going with it, because it's just evolving. It's just evolving so quickly. I'm personally I had a period of mourning for some weeks where I just thought, what the hell's going on? And now I'm kind of I've come back to it. I'm completely excited for all the cool things we're going to be able to do.
Okay, let me we've almost finished our time, and that question, Cedric. There's about 10 million really great minds in the world thinking through that right now, so it's a bit of a tough one. But Michael, just one for the last question. Michael, do you want to put your point forward?
Yeah, thanks, Evan. It was a really interesting talk. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the three. You said that this has been a project over 10 years, but really you've been sort of functioning as a startup for the last 3 years. What has happened over the last 3 years that maybe surprised you, or something that you hadn't considered that sort of jumped out and you think, oh, well, that's something we need to overcome, or one of the sort of unseen problems that you encountered over the last 3 years?
Yeah, I think the first one is just on that relationship piece, like about building those relationships with the folks who are around you. Most people are really there to see you win, and like leaning on them where you can and build those relationships will just help you immensely. The other one was just kind of on building a team, and particularly with regards to empowering a team. It's very easy to have a top-down approach and say, okay, we wake up, we need to get this, and this done, and then saying to people this, and this done. And maybe that works when you're 5 people, or maybe it works when you're 10 people. But as soon as you go to any kind of scale above that, the teams and people are typically we typically work with pretty smart people. You need to empower them, and you need to give them the autonomy and the ability to grow in this way. This is a very difficult concept to actually do in practice. It's easy to talk about, and it's difficult in practice. You need to go from a company of a few people contributing something to an organization which builds stuff. And I haven't figured this out yet. And obviously this is a full thing you're going through, but doing that is a big challenge for a lot of folks. It involves having great managers, great communication, over communication, empowerment, trust, a lot of really important things, which is difficult to come from.
Fantastic. For the sake of time, Evan, we could probably talk to you the rest of the day quite easily. I certainly could. But thank you. That's an amazing presentation. The bit rate was enormous. I have had I can resonate with some of your experiences. I think it was Reid Hoffman from LinkedIn who said that an entrepreneur is someone who jumps off a cliff and builds a parachute on the way down. I can sense you built a parachute quite quickly, and you've learned a huge amount. There's no doubt your brain power around sort of computational biology is there, but I suspect what you've learned on the entrepreneurial side, and you talk about funding, about selling, about all sorts of things, which 3 years ago or 5 years never knew about. So maybe a last comment from you. What's it been like building that parachute, about things you had no idea about beforehand?
Yeah, I think the quote is, building a startup is like jumping off a cliff and assembling an airplane on the way down. And building a group of people to assemble the airplane as well. I guess you've got to start piece by piece, build the glider before you build the 747. It's been, in terms of a personal journey, it's sort of like nothing else. This is a personal experience, something that I will almost certainly I won't get to do again. It's a one-off opportunity, and I'm something ever grateful for the opportunity it's given me to do. So that's why I said about the piece about doing it. If you told me 5 years ago, at the time when I was doing this business school, that all the things that would have happened over the 5 years, I would have laughed you out of the room. But so hence the kind of the reason for just going for it and jumping off the cliff.
Fantastic. Okay, Evan, if we were all in one place, we'd give you a standing ovation, I'm sure. But thank you very much from all of us.
Thanks so much, folks. I really appreciate it. And so if you want to reach out to me anytime on any startup ideas, I'm super interested to always talk on that and help you through any problems that you have with regards to that. So yeah, the offer's always open.
Fantastic. Thanks
folks.